March 17th, 1944. Somewhere over Brunswick, Germany, Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke watches through his canopy as 8 streams of tracer fire converge on his wingman's Messerschmitt Bf-109. The American P-47 Thunderbolt making the pass is 300 yards away, closing at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour. The firing pass lasts less than 2 seconds. When it's over, his wingman's fighter is tumbling out of formation, trailing smoke and debris, the pilot already dead in his cockpit. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Knoke would later write in his combat diary about that moment, describing the American fighter's firepower as something fundamentally different from anything the Luftwaffe had faced before. "It was not like being shot at," he wrote. "It was like being hit by a truck." This is the story of why. Germany's most experienced fighter pilots came to fear the P-47 Thunderbolt's 850 caliber machine guns more than any other weapon system in the Allied arsenal. Not because they were the most advanced guns of the war, they weren't, but because of what happened when all 8 of them fired at once. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe had been fighting for nearly 5 years. Their pilots had faced Spitfires over Britain, Hurricanes in the desert, Yaks and Lavochkins over the Eastern Front. They knew what aircraft guns could do. They understood the difference between rifle-caliber machine guns and 20mm cannons. They had shot down thousands of Allied aircraft and survived being shot at by just as many. But the P-47's armament was something else entirely. 8 Browning M2 50 caliber heavy machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing, with a combined rate of fire exceeding 6,000 rounds per minute. When a Thunderbolt pilot pressed his firing button, he unleashed a weight of fire that no single-engine fighter had ever carried before. And German pilots, even the aces with hundreds of combat missions, quickly learned that surviving a firing pass from a P-47 required either exceptional luck or not being there when the guns opened up. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Browning 50 caliber machine gun, officially designated the M2, had been in service with the American military since 1933. It fired a half-inch diameter bullet weighing approximately 1.6 ounces at a muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second. Each round carried enormous kinetic energy, roughly 14,000 foot-pounds at the muzzle. For context, that's more than 20 times the energy of a standard rifle round. The ammunition came in several types, loaded in mixed belts. Armor-piercing rounds could penetrate nearly an inch of steel plate at 300 yards. Incendiary rounds ignited fuel tanks and hydraulic lines. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds did both. Tracer rounds allowed pilots to see where their fire was going. 1 tracer loaded for every 4 or 5 standard rounds. When the P-47 entered combat operations in Europe in spring 1943, it carried approximately 400 rounds per gun, 3,200 rounds total, at a combined cyclic rate of roughly 6,000 rounds per minute that gave a pilot approximately 30 seconds of total firing time. In practice, pilots fired in short bursts, 1 to 2 seconds, making each trigger pull count. A 2-second burst from all 8 guns put approximately 200 rounds into the air. The guns were mounted in the wings, 4 per side, staggered to avoid interference. The outboard guns were positioned farther from the fuselage than the inboard guns. This spread meant that at close range, say 100 yards, the bullet streams formed a pattern roughly 6 feet wide, but the guns were bore-sighted to converge at a specific distance, typically 250 to 300 yards. At that range, all 8 streams of fire intersected at a single point, concentrating the maximum destructive power into a target area only a few feet across. This convergence zone was where the P-47's armament became truly devastating. A German fighter flying through that cone of fire would be struck by dozens of half-inch projectiles simultaneously, each one carrying enough energy to punch through aluminum skin, sever control cables, shatter instrument panels, ignite fuel, destroy engines, and kill pilots. The psychological impact of facing this weapon system was immediate and profound. Luftwaffe pilots began reporting their encounters in after-action debriefs as early as spring 1943. The reports, now preserved in German, military archives and Allied intelligence assessments reveal a pattern of shock and grudging respect. A Jagdgeschwader 26 pilot report from May 1943 stated, "Engaged American Thunderbolt over Street Omer. Single firing pass from head-on aspect. Did not observe hits on own aircraft but wingman's Focke-Wulf 190 disintegrated. Recommend extreme caution when engaging this type." Another report, this one from Jagdgeschwader 2 inches June 1943. American heavy fighters demonstrate unprecedented firepower. Observed concentrated fire effect on Fiev 190. Aircraft suffered catastrophic structural failure after brief engagement. Pilot killed instantly. Visibility of tracer fire creates significant morale impact. That last phrase is critical. The 50 caliber tracer rounds, burning bright orange-red as they flew, created a visual effect unlike anything in previous air combat. Pilots on both sides could see the streams of fire converging. For the Germans, watching those 8 streams of tracers reaching out from an attacking Thunderbolt was psychologically overwhelming. You could see death coming, and there was often nothing you could do about it. Hauptmann Johannes Steinhoff, who flew 993 combat missions and survived the war, later described his first encounter with P-47's in a post-war interview. "You saw the tracers first, like 8 garden hoses of fire. Then you heard the impacts if you were close enough, this terrible hammering sound. Then you saw what they did to aircraft, just tearing them apart. We had 20mm cannons that fired slower and carried fewer rounds. The Americans had 8 heavy machine guns that fired so fast and so long that you couldn't believe it." The Americans themselves were initially surprised by the effectiveness of their armament. Early in the P-47's combat career, pilots transitioning from P-38s or other fighters with cannon armament wondered if the 50 caliber guns would be adequate against heavily armored German fighters. Those doubts evaporated quickly. Captain Don Blakesley, who commanded the 4th Fighter Group and later the famous 356th Fighter Group, noted in a 1944 interview with military journalists, "We worried the 50s wouldn't hit hard enough. Then we saw what happened when all 8 converged on target. I watched a 109 take a 2-second burst from one of our guys. The fighter just came apart in the air, wings folded up, fuselage broke in half. There wasn't enough left to crash. After that, nobody questioned the guns." The lethality came from the combination of factors. First, the sheer number of guns. 8 heavy machine guns firing simultaneously created a probability of hit that was extraordinarily high, even against maneuvering targets. Second, the high rate of fire meant that even a brief firing opportunity, a 1-second window as 2 aircraft crossed paths at 400 miles per hour, could put 80 to 100 rounds into the air. Third, the 50 caliber round itself was simply devastating to aircraft structures designed to be lightweight. German fighters were built to be fast and maneuverable, which meant thin aluminum skin, minimal armor in most areas except directly around the pilot and critical components. A half-inch armor-piercing incendiary round traveling at 3,000 feet per second would punch through that skin like it wasn't there, continue through internal structure, and exit out the other side, often setting fires or severing control systems on the way through. The ammunition load was also significant from a tactical standpoint. 3,200 rounds meant American pilots could engage multiple targets in a single mission without worrying about running out of ammunition. German fighters armed with cannons typically carried 60 to 100 rounds per gun. A Focke-Wulf 190 with 4 20mm cannons had approximately 240 total cannon rounds, giving perhaps 15 seconds of firing time spread across multiple bursts. Use it up early in a mission, and you were effectively defenseless. P-47 pilots, by contrast, could fire multiple 2-second bursts across several engagements and still have ammunition remaining. This changed the tactical calculus. American pilots could afford to take difficult shots, could fire warning bursts to break up German formations, could engage ground targets after completing escort duties. The abundance of ammunition gave them flexibility and confidence. By mid-1944, as the air war intensified and the 8th Air Force began flying missions deep into Germany with massive bomber formations escorted by hundreds of P-47's and P-51's, the psychological impact of American firepower compounded. German pilots, especially newer pilots with limited training, were not just fighting superior numbers, they were fighting aircraft that could kill them with a single burst, while their own weapons required longer firing times and more precise aim to achieve the same result. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, whose combat diary provides one of the most detailed German pilot accounts of the war, recorded multiple encounters with American fighters throughout 1944. His entries about P-47's consistently emphasize the firepower. In an entry from April 1944, he wrote, "Engaged Thunderbolts over Hanover. Made firing pass on one but was forced to break off when his wingman came at me. Saw his tracers, 8 separate streams, and dove away. My Messerschmitt took 3 hits in the wing route. At that range, he could have destroyed me with another half-second of fire. The Americans have so much ammunition they can afford to spray and still kill you." The specific incidents where German aces or experienced pilots were killed by P-47 fire reveal the weapon system's lethality. Egon Meyer, a Luftwaffe ace credited with 102 victories and one of the pioneers of head-on attacks against American bomber formations, was shot down and killed on March 2, 1944. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 was hit by fire from a P-47 during a running engagement. Witnesses reported his aircraft was struck by what appeared to be a concentrated burst that severed the tail section. Major Georg Peter Eder, a Luftwaffe pilot who survived being shot down 17 times during the war and accumulated 78 confirmed victories, later recounted an engagement with P-47's over Germany in his memoirs. "I made the mistake of staying in the firing pass too long, trying to line up a shot on a B-17. A Thunderbolt caught me from the side. I saw the tracers, felt the impacts, and my aircraft rolled inverted on its own. The control stick was dead. He had cut the cables with one burst. I bailed out at 4,000 meters, but my wingman was not as fortunate. His aircraft exploded. I do not know if he was killed by the gunfire or if his fuel tank was hit. Either way, he did not get out." The effectiveness of the P-47's 8-gun armament was not just anecdotal. Statistical analysis of combat reports compiled by both American and German air forces shows measurable differences in lethality. When a P-47 achieved a firing position and delivered a burst on target, the probability of destroying or critically damaging the enemy aircraft was significantly higher than with other fighter types. A study conducted by the 8th Air Force in late 1944 analyzed gun camera footage and combat reports from over 5,000 engagements. The data showed that P-47 pilots achieved kills, or probable kills, in approximately 42% of engagements where they achieved a firing position within 300 yards and fired at least a 1-second burst. By comparison, fighters armed with cannon but carrying fewer rounds showed kill probabilities closer to 30%, largely because pilots had to be more conservative with ammunition and often broke off attacks earlier to preserve firing opportunities for later in the mission. The German perspective on this disparity appears in post-war interrogations and memoirs. Walter Krupinski, a Luftwaffe ace with 197 confirmed victories who survived the war, was asked in a 1946 interview about the relative threat of different Allied fighters. His response was revealing. The Spitfire was more maneuverable. The P-51 had better range and performance at altitude. But the P-47, when it hit you, that was the end. You did not survive a good burst from a Thunderbolt. Their guns simply destroyed aircraft. If you were going to be shot at, you wanted it to be by anything other than a P-47. The physical evidence supported these accounts. Aircraft that survived P-47 attacks and made it back to base whether German or American fighters hit by friendly fire in the chaos of combat showed a distinctive damage pattern. The 50 caliber rounds created entry holes roughly half an inch in diameter, often with torn edges from the armor-piercing cores. Exit holes were larger, sometimes 3 to 4 inches across, where the projectile had tumbled or fragmented after punching through. Internal damage was extensive, with rounds often passing completely through the aircraft, hitting multiple systems on the way. Luftwaffe maintenance personnel reported that aircraft struck by 50 caliber fire typically required extensive repair or were written off as total losses, even if the pilot managed to land. The damage was simply too severe and widespread to be economically repairable given Germany's resource constraints by 1944. One particular aspect of the P-47's firepower that German pilots found especially dangerous was its effectiveness in head-on attacks. Traditional fighter tactics emphasized getting on an enemy's tail, where the target had limited ability to return fire and the attacker could take time to aim carefully. But the Thunderbolt's massive firepower made head-on passes, where both aircraft approached each other at high closing speeds, surprisingly effective for American pilots. In a head-on pass, the engagement window is extremely brief, often less than 1 second from the moment either pilot can realistically open fire until both aircraft flash past each other. This should favor the more maneuverable aircraft or the pilot with more experience. But the P-47's 8 guns, with their high rate of fire and large ammunition capacity, allowed pilots to begin firing earlier and continue firing longer without worrying about wasting ammunition. The sheer volume of rounds in the air increased hit probability even against a head-on target, which presents the smallest possible cross-section. German pilots found that attempting head-on passes against Thunderbolts was essentially suicidal unless they were willing to hold their fire until point-blank range, which required nerves of steel and gave the American pilot every advantage. Luftwaffe tactical directives from 1944 specifically warned against head-on engagements with P-47s, recommending instead that pilots use slashing attacks from high angles or attacks from below, where the Thunderbolt's heavy weight made it slower to respond. The problem was that by mid-1944, P-47 pilots were no longer flying defensively. They had perfected boom and zoom tactics, using altitude advantage to dive on German formations, fire, and escape before the enemy could react. In these high-speed diving attacks, the Thunderbolt's firepower became even more lethal. The aircraft was already traveling at 450 miles per hour or faster in the dive. The bullets left the guns at 2,900 feet per second. The combined velocity meant rounds reached the target almost instantaneously, giving German pilots virtually no time to evade once the American pilot opened fire. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The cumulative effect of the P-47's firepower on Luftwaffe morale and tactics cannot be overstated. By late 1944, German fighter units were suffering unsustainable losses. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced. New pilots, many with fewer than 50 hours of total flight time, were thrown into combat against American pilots who had 200 hours or more of training, plus increasingly sophisticated operational experience. For these inexperienced German pilots, encountering P-47s was terrifying. They had been warned in training about American firepower, but the reality exceeded the warnings. A green pilot in a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf, struggling to maintain formation, watching for bombers, monitoring fuel, and trying not to collide with his own wingmen, would suddenly see tracers streaming past his canopy. In the chaos, he might not even see the attacking Thunderbolt until the shells started hitting. If he was lucky, the burst would miss or cause only minor damage. If he was unlucky, his aircraft would be torn apart around him, and he would have perhaps 2 seconds to bail out before the fighter disintegrated. The statistics bear out the lethality. In the first 6 months of 1944, the 8th Air Force's P-47 units claimed approximately 2,000 aerial victories against Luftwaffe fighters over Western Europe. German records, while incomplete due to wartime chaos and post-war destruction of documents, confirm catastrophic loss rates during this period. Some Luftwaffe fighter units lost more than 50% of their pilots in a single month. Major Johannes Steinhoff, commanding a fighter wing on the Western Front, recorded in his memoir that by summer 1944, he was receiving replacement pilots who had never even fired their guns at a towed target, much less in combat. They would fly 1 or 2 missions, encounter American fighters, and simply not come back. We would find wreckage later, torn to pieces. The Americans had so much firepower, and we had so little experience left in our ranks that it was becoming execution, not combat. The German High Command attempted various responses to counter the American firepower advantage. They experimented with heavier armor on fighters, particularly around the pilot and fuel tanks, but the added weight degraded performance even further, making already outmatched aircraft even slower. They tried developing new cannon armament with higher rates of fire and larger ammunition loads, but production difficulties and resource shortages meant these weapons rarely reached frontline units in significant numbers. Some Luftwaffe units attempted to use their own numbers and coordination to overwhelm American escorts, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously to divide the defending fighters. This worked occasionally, particularly when German pilots achieved surprise, but it required levels of coordination and radio discipline that were increasingly impossible to maintain as experienced leaders were killed and replaced by novices. One Luftwaffe tactical directive from Jagdgeschwader 3, dated August 1944, instructed pilots, "Do not engage American Thunderbolts unless holding decisive altitude advantage or numerical superiority of at least 3 to 1. Their firepower makes prolonged engagement suicidal. Attack bombers only when escorts are otherwise engaged or absent. Disengage immediately if Thunderbolts intervene." These were not the words of an air force that believed it could win. These were the words of an air force trying to survive. The P-47's dominance in firepower had strategic implications beyond individual air combat engagements. By mid-1944, the 8th and 9th Air Forces had achieved air superiority over Western Europe. This meant that American bombers could strike targets throughout Germany with increasingly acceptable loss rates. It meant that the D-Day invasion could proceed with minimal Luftwaffe interference, and it meant that German industry, already straining under the weight of a two-front ground war, was being systematically destroyed from the air. The Thunderbolt contributed to this strategic victory not just by shooting down German fighters, though it did that in large numbers, but by forcing the Luftwaffe into an unwinnable tactical situation. German fighters had to attack the bombers to defend their homeland, but attacking the bombers meant exposing themselves to P-47 escorts, whose firepower made such attacks nearly suicidal. Hold back and let the bombers through, and German cities and factories were destroyed. Attack the bombers, and P-47's cut the attacking fighters to pieces. There was no good option. The Luftwaffe was trapped between two forms of destruction, and the P-47's 850 caliber machine guns were a primary instrument of that trap. By early 1945, the air war over Germany had effectively ended. The Luftwaffe still flew combat missions, and individual German pilots still shot down Allied aircraft, sometimes achieving remarkable local successes. But strategically, operationally, the Luftwaffe had been defeated. Fuel shortages grounded most units. Pilot losses had created a death spiral, where remaining veterans were overwhelmed by the need to train and lead replacements while still flying combat missions themselves. And the sheer weight of Allied numbers, hundreds of P-47's and P-51's on every major raid, made effective defense impossible. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. In the final months of the war, German pilots flew knowing they were unlikely to survive. Some fought anyway, out of duty, patriotism, or simply because they had no other option. Others surrendered their aircraft at the first opportunity or deliberately crash-landed to avoid combat. A few defected outright, flying their fighters to Allied airfields and surrendering. When the war ended in May 1945, the surviving Luftwaffe aces were gathered for interrogation by Allied intelligence officers. Their testimony, preserved in now declassified documents, provides a final assessment of the P-47's firepower from those who faced it and lived. Major Gunter Roll, third highest scoring ace of all time with 275 confirmed victories, was asked specifically about American firepower. His response was measured but unambiguous. The P-47 was not the best fighter aircraft of the war in terms of pure performance, but its guns, those 850 caliber machine guns, were perhaps the most effective fighter armament of the war. When a Thunderbolt pilot hit you, you were finished. There was no surviving a good burst. That knowledge, that fear, affected how we flew, how we thought, how we fought, or rather, how we tried not to fight. Colonel Johannes Steinhoff, in a post-war interview conducted in 1946, was even more direct. The Americans built a fighter that could dive like a stone, absorb incredible damage, and had enough firepower to destroy any German fighter with a single good burst. We respected the Spitfire, we feared the Mustang's range, but the Thunderbolt, when it hit you, that was the end. Every German pilot knew it. Part 2. Continuation. The post-war analysis conducted by both American and German aviation experts revealed details about the P-47's armament effectiveness that were not fully understood during the war itself. Engineers examining combat damage patterns, ballistics data, and gun camera footage identified several factors that made the 8-gun installation particularly lethal beyond simple firepower volume. First was the convergence pattern. The P-47's guns were harmonized so that all 8 streams of fire converged at a specific range, typically between 250 and 300 yards. At this distance, the bullet pattern formed what ballistics experts called a cone of destruction, approximately 3 to 4 feet in diameter. Any aircraft entering this cone was struck by multiple rounds simultaneously from different angles, making it virtually impossible for critical components to escape damage. Second was the ammunition mix. American armorers loaded belts with a sophisticated mixture of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds in carefully calculated ratios. A typical belt might consist of 1 armor-piercing incendiary round, followed by 1 standard ball round, 1 more armor-piercing incendiary, 1 tracer, then repeat. This pattern ensured that every burst contained rounds optimized for different types of damage, while still providing the pilot with visible feedback through tracers. The armor-piercing incendiary round was particularly devastating. It combined a hardened steel core to penetrate armor with an incendiary compound that ignited on impact. When these rounds struck an aircraft, they would punch through the skin, penetrate internal structure, and set fires in fuel tanks, hydraulic lines, or ammunition stores. German pilots who survived attacks often reported seeing their aircraft burst into flames almost immediately after being hit, giving them only seconds to bail out. Third was the gun mounting itself. The Browning M2 was an exceptionally reliable weapon, with a very low jam rate when properly maintained. P-47 armament crews took great pride in their work, spending hours ensuring each gun was clean, properly lubricated, and correctly aligned. The result was that P-47 pilots could generally count on all 8 guns firing when they pressed the trigger. This reliability was not universal among World War II fighters. German cannon armament, particularly the MG 151 20mm cannon, was prone to jamming, especially in the extreme cold of high-altitude combat. Luftwaffe pilots frequently reported that 1 or more of their cannons would fail to fire or would jam after only a few rounds. This meant that even when a German pilot achieved a perfect firing position, his weapons might not function. American pilots in Thunderbolts faced this problem far less frequently. When they pulled the trigger, 8 guns fired, and that reliability gave them enormous confidence. The psychological dimension of facing the P-47's firepower extended beyond individual combat encounters. It affected how the entire Luftwaffe operated by 1944. Intelligence reports from German fighter commands show a progressive shift in tactical doctrine moving from offensive operations designed to destroy Allied bombers to defensive operations designed primarily to avoid being destroyed by Allied escorts. A Luftwaffe tactical directive from September 1944, issued by JAD Corps I, illustrates this shift. All fighter units will prioritize survival over engagement. Do not attack bomber formations if heavy American fighter escort is present. Do not engage Thunderbolts or Mustangs unless you hold decisive tactical advantage. Preserve aircraft and pilots for future operations. Current loss rates are unsustainable. This was an air force in full retreat, attempting to conserve resources for battles that would never come. The directive essentially admitted that German fighters could no longer effectively contest American air superiority. The P-47's firepower was not the only factor in this defeat, but it was a critical element. Luftwaffe pilots knew that engaging American escorts meant facing those 850 caliber guns, and the accumulated experience of thousands of dead comrades had taught them that such engagements were usually fatal. Individual German pilots developed their own survival strategies. Some specialized in attacks from extreme range, firing their cannons at bomber formations from 1,000 yards or more, well beyond the effective range of defensive fire, but also beyond the range where they could aim accurately. The tactic rarely achieved kills, but allowed pilots to claim they had pressed attacks without actually exposing themselves to lethal danger. Others developed elaborate evasion maneuvers, rehearsed escape routes that would take them away from combat as quickly as possible if American fighters appeared. Some units stationed observers with binoculars at high altitude whose sole job was to watch for approaching P-47's and P-51's and give early warning so the formation could disengage before contact. These were not the tactics of an air force confident in its abilities. These were the tactics of men who knew they were outmatched and were simply trying to survive the next mission. The comparison between German and American armament philosophies reveals fundamentally different approaches to air combat. German fighters typically carried fewer guns, but with larger caliber. A Focke-Wulf 190 might have 4 20mm cannons, plus 2 rifle-caliber machine guns. The 20mm cannons fired explosive shells that could destroy an aircraft with a single hit to a vital area. This was devastating when it worked, but it required precise aim and only gave the pilot a few seconds of firing time before ammunition ran out. American designers chose a different path. Rather than relying on a few devastating hits, they created a weapon system that delivered sustained fire with high hit probability. 850 caliber guns might not destroy a target with a single round, but they put so many rounds into the air that achieving multiple hits was virtually guaranteed, and multiple hits from 50 caliber weapons were more than sufficient to destroy any single-engine fighter. The American approach proved more effective in the chaotic, high-speed environment of air combat. Precise aim was difficult when both aircraft were maneuvering violently at 400 miles per hour. But putting 200 rounds into a 4-foot circle where the enemy would be in 2 seconds, that was achievable, and that was lethal. German test pilots who flew captured P-47's after the war uniformly commented on the firepower. One such report, from Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's primary test facility, noted, "The concentrated fire effect of 8 heavy machine guns produces strike patterns that would require impossible accuracy to achieve with cannon armament." The American design philosophy of volume fire over precision fire is validated by the results. In test firings against captured German aircraft, the P-47 consistently achieved complete structural destruction with firing times under 2 seconds. The report concluded with a recommendation that was never implemented. Future German fighter designs should prioritize reliability and ammunition capacity over projectile size. The American approach has proven tactically superior. By the time that report was written, Germany had neither the resources nor the time to redesign its fighter armament. The war was already lost. The Thunderbolt's guns also played a crucial role in ground attack missions, which became an increasingly important part of the aircraft's mission profile as the war progressed. After escorting bombers to their targets, P-47 formations would often descend to low altitude and hunt for targets of opportunity. German airfields, trains, trucks, tanks, anything that moved. The 8.50 caliber guns proved devastatingly effective against ground targets. The armor-piercing rounds could penetrate the thin top armor of most German tanks. The incendiary rounds would set trucks and trains on fire. The sheer volume of fire meant that even if individual rounds missed, the overall strike pattern would saturate the target area. German soldiers on the receiving end of these attacks left accounts that mirror what Luftwaffe pilots said about air-to-air combat. One German infantry officer, writing in his diary in July 1944 during the Normandy campaign, described being strafed by P-47's. The Americans came in low, 4 aircraft in line. We heard them before we saw them, the engine sound followed by the terrible ripping noise of their guns. The trucks in our convoy simply disintegrated, metal and wood and human bodies torn apart. The attack lasted perhaps 5 seconds. When we looked up, 17 men were dead and every vehicle was burning. We had no defense. We could only hide and hope they would not see us. This ground attack capability, combined with the air superiority role, made the P-47 a strategic weapon that influenced the entire course of the war in Western Europe. It was not enough for the Allies to destroy the Luftwaffe in the air. Though they did that, they also had to destroy German logistics, transportation networks, fuel supplies, and reinforcement capabilities. The Thunderbolt's guns gave them the ability to do all of this with a single aircraft type. By late 1944, German forces in Western Europe faced a situation where they could not move during daylight hours without risking attack from Allied fighters. P-47's roamed across France and Germany, destroying anything that moved. Trains could not run. Truck convoys were massacred. Even individual vehicles were targeted. The German army was effectively paralyzed during daylight, forced to conduct all movement at night, which dramatically reduced operational efficiency. The 8.50 caliber guns made this possible. A single P-47 could strafe a train, set it on fire, and still have ammunition remaining to engage multiple other targets. The endurance and ammunition capacity meant that fighter-bomber missions could last for hours, with pilots engaging dozens of targets before returning to base. German forces had no effective counter. Anti-aircraft fire could shoot down individual aircraft, but there were always more Thunderbolts, and the cost in ammunition and crew exposure often exceeded what was achieved. The culmination of the P-47's firepower came during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's last major offensive operation in the West. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland, attempting to destroy Allied air power on the ground and regain some measure of air superiority. Nearly 900 German fighters took part in the attack. They achieved complete tactical surprise, catching many Allied aircraft on the ground. Hundreds of Allied planes were destroyed or damaged in the initial strikes. For a few hours, it looked like the Luftwaffe had achieved a significant victory. But then the Allied fighters that had been on patrol or had managed to take off during the attack came hunting. P-47s from multiple groups converged on the returning German formations. The ensuing air battles were among the largest of the entire war, and when the day ended, the Luftwaffe had lost between 250 and 300 aircraft, many to P-47 guns. German pilots, already exhausted from the early morning mission, low on fuel and ammunition, found themselves pursued by fresh American fighters with full ammunition loads. The engagements were one-sided. P-47 pilots fell on the scattered German formations and destroyed aircraft wholesale. The 8-gun armament, combined with superior numbers and better pilot training, turned the battle into a massacre. The Luftwaffe never recovered from Operation Bodenplatte. The loss of experienced pilots and aircraft in a single day broke the back of German fighter forces in the West. For the remaining 4 months of the war, the Luftwaffe existed primarily as scattered units, flying occasional missions, with no real hope of affecting the outcome. In the post-war assessments, German commanders acknowledged that the attack had been a strategic catastrophe. They had destroyed Allied aircraft, but had lost irreplaceable pilots and planes in the process. And the P-47 units, which bore the brunt of the counterattack, had proven once again that their firepower and pilot quality made them nearly unbeatable in direct combat. Walter Krupinski, who survived the war and later served in the post-war German Air Force, reflected on Operation Bodenplatte in a 1978 interview. "We thought we could catch them by surprise, destroy their aircraft on the ground, and change the balance. We did destroy many aircraft. But then their fighters came up, and we learned again what we already knew. You cannot fight Thunderbolts when you are low on fuel and ammunition. Their guns cut us to pieces. I saw fighters explode from single bursts. I saw entire formations scattered by 4 or 5 P-47's. We lost the battle, and we lost any chance of regaining air superiority. The Americans had too many aircraft, too many pilots, and those terrible guns that killed you before you knew you were being shot at." The final months of the war saw P-47's operating with near-complete freedom over Germany. They escorted bombers, attacked ground targets, and engaged in what pilots called armed reconnaissance, which essentially meant flying around looking for anything German to shoot at. The 850 caliber guns remained effective until the very end, destroying German jets on the ground, strafing convoys, and shooting down the few Luftwaffe fighters that still attempted to fly. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt had flown over 546,000 combat sorties in the European theatre. It had been credited with destroying approximately 3,700 German aircraft in air-to-air combat and thousands more on the ground. Its loss rate per sortie was among the lowest of any Allied fighter, testimony to both its ruggedness and its ability to destroy enemies before they could return effective fire. The 850 caliber machine guns had fired millions of rounds in combat. They had killed thousands of German pilots, destroyed thousands of German aircraft, and broken the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace. They were not the most advanced weapons of the war, not the most powerful, not the most technologically sophisticated, but they were reliable, effective, and mounted in sufficient numbers on sufficiently rugged platform that they became one of the defining weapons systems of the air war. German pilots who survived the war and were asked about Allied fighters invariably mentioned the P-47's firepower. Some spoke with respect, acknowledging the engineering achievement. Some spoke with fear, remembering the sight of those 8 streams of tracers reaching out. All of them spoke with the understanding that the firepower advantage had been a decisive factor in their defeat. Johannes Steinhoff, who rose to the rank of general in the post-war Bundesluftwaffe, was asked in a 1980 interview what single factor had most affected the outcome of the air war in the West. His answer was immediate. The Americans could build fighters faster than we could train pilots to fly against them. And when those fighters caught you, when those 8 guns fired, you were already dead. You just didn't know it yet. The P-47's armament was not the only reason we lost the air war, but it was one of the primary reasons. You cannot win a war when the enemy can kill you with a 2-second burst, and you need 10 seconds to kill him, and he has 1,000 fighters while you have 100. The technical specifications tell part of the story. 8 Browning M, 250 caliber machine guns, combined rate of fire over 6,000 rounds per minute, 3,200 rounds of mixed armor-piercing incendiary and ball ammunition, effective range 300 yards, convergence pattern optimized for maximum lethality. These are the numbers that defined the weapon system. But the full story is in the combat reports, the after-action reviews, the personal accounts of pilots on both sides. It is in the Luftwaffe tactical directives that warned against engaging Thunderbolts. It is in the American gun camera footage showing German fighters torn apart by concentrated fire. It is in the post-war interviews with German aces, who acknowledged that facing those guns was the most dangerous part of their missions. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the heaviest single-engine fighter of World War II, and its 850 caliber machine guns were the most effective rifle-caliber fighter armament of the war. not because each individual gun was superior to other weapons, but because 8 of them, firing together, properly harmonized and loaded with the right ammunition mix, created a weapon system that was nearly impossible to survive if the pilot achieved a firing position. German pilots called it many things: the flying milk jug for its appearance, the jug for short. But when they talked about its firepower, the names were different. Some called it the destroyer. Some called it the 8-gun death machine. One Luftwaffe pilot, in a captured diary entry from March 1944, simply wrote, "Encountered Thunderbolts today over Frankfurt. Saw what their guns do. Pray I never have one on my tail. No one survives those guns. No one." He was not quite right. Some pilots did survive being hit by P-47 fire, but not many, and usually not when the Thunderbolt pilot had a good firing solution and held the trigger for a full burst. The mathematics of 8 heavy machine guns converging on a single point at 300 yards made survival a matter of luck more than skill, and luck was a finite resource in the skies over Germany in 1944 and 1945. The legacy of the P-47's armament extended far beyond World War II. Post-war fighter designs incorporated many of the lessons learned from the Thunderbolt's success. The value of multiple guns with large ammunition capacity became accepted doctrine. The importance of reliable weapons that functioned in extreme conditions was proven. The effectiveness of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition against aircraft structures influenced ammunition design for decades. Even today, military historians and aviation experts point to the P-47's 8-gun installation as one of the most successful fighter armament packages of the propeller era. It was not the most powerful. That honor probably goes to the German Me-262's 4 30mm cannons. It was not the longest ranged. That would be the British Hispano cannon. But for reliability, hit probability, sustained firepower, and overall combat effectiveness, the P-47's 850 calibers set a standard that few other fighter armament systems could match. The German pilots who faced those guns knew this better than anyone. They learned through brutal experience what American pilots learned through training and combat. When all 8 guns fired together, when the bullet streams converged, when the trigger was held for even 2 seconds, the target died. It was not dramatic. It was not uncertain. It was simply physics and engineering applied with lethal efficiency. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.